Welcome to the Daily Word Bible Study, a plain and simple book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse study through the entire Bible. Currently, we are in the book of Romans, chapter 4. We're talking about the subject of faith, and I'm going to spend some time on faith. And there's a couple of reasons why I take time to do this, because as we're moving through the book, the books of the Bible, I will take time to address the important issues or the essential issues. And when we come to um, biblical, let's say, subject, there is what's called the essentials of the faith, and then there's the non-essentials of the faith. Now, non-essentials of the faith doesn't mean that they're not important, and it certainly doesn't mean that we disregard them. So, for example, speaking in tongues, okay, is a non-essential. And there are people that agree or disagree. And and the reason why that's acceptable, in other words, to agree or to disagree, is because it's a non-essential. What makes it a non-essential is because what is plainly taught about speaking in tongues is never mentioned, is that you got to believe this or you have to speak in tongues in order to be saved. In other words, when we talk about the essentials of the faith, those are the subjects. Those are the things that are plainly and mainly stated in Scripture. And how do we know? Because it's stated over and over again. One of the biggest things, and you hear me address from time to time, um, different theologies, and there are plenty of them. Works is one. And I'm going to circle back around for that in a moment. Let's say, for example, water baptism. That there are people that believe you have to be baptized in water. And what they've done is they take a non-essential and made it an essential in their theology. Now, how do you know it's a non-essential? Because isn't it amazing that every time you see salvation, you never see, not never, but you don't see water baptism. Which, if water baptism was an essential, you would see it certainly mentioned where, for example, John 3:16, the gospel of the world, that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him will not perish but have everlasting life. Why wouldn't he say, unless you be baptized in water? Well, why isn't water mentioned? We just studied Romans 3:19 through the end of the chapter, and again, not one mention of water. And that's part of the problem, because you take a non-essential and you make it an essential of the faith. And even in one of the verses that they love to use, which is Mark 16:16, which says, and Jesus is speaking, he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, but he that believeth not shall be damned. But the others, the first half is what they kind of, they latch onto. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. See, you got to be baptized. Jesus said it. You got to be baptized. Well, yeah, you got to believe, but you got to be baptized. If you're not baptized, it nullifies belief. But then the other half of that, he that believeth not shall be damned. Now, right there in that sentence is, if Jesus took the time to say believe twice and baptism only once, well, where is the emphasis? What is he emphasizing? And when you add that to the plethora of the New Testament scripture, where water baptism is rarely mentioned, and when it is mentioned, you put it in the context in which it is intended to take. And that's kind of the problem right here. So when we talk about then this subject of faith, that faith is mentioned over and over and over and over and over and over again. It's just literally mentioned over and over again. And yet, if it's mentioned over and over and over and over and over again, and you don't have one mention of like water baptism, again, but you see how people are blinded by denominational, their denominational theology. Okay, But then also when you look at the tenor of Scripture, the plethora of Scripture. For example, as we're reading here, and let me just jump to it, Romans chapter 4, and so right, if in the very first two verses, notice what he says. What then can we say that Abraham, our physical ancestor, has found if Abraham was justified by works? So right here, and then remember, we contrast this with James' statement that his faith was justified by works, right? Was not his justified, was not his faith. He uses the term works, but certainly he is not teaching on the subject of salvation. He was teaching on the subject of faith itself. So that's why there's no contradiction in Scripture, for my point here. But that's what he says, that Abraham was justified if Abraham was justified by works. And the reason why I wanted to kind of emphasize this statement is because God in his wisdom knew some of the most stumbling blocks. And by the way, we can put water baptism in the category of works because this is what they say you must do in order to be saved, other than salvation or faith. Now, he says if Abraham was justified by works, right? So he nullifies that. And remember, and this issue here is very throughout the Scripture that God mentions works, because this is, look at every denomination in one form or another. Every denomination has in it works by salvation, works. They have in it some form works by salvation. So when you understand it, I'm like the Catholics. I'm saying the Catholics. One of the principles of the doctrine is that you have to have works plus faith, and of course other denominations have in it some, again, like I mentioned before, water baptism, or the Pentecostal holiness. Um, Pentecostal holiness people, they say that you have to live right. You have to live holy, and again, it's holy according to their um, theology. You know, women can't wear pants, jewelry, makeup, or be worldly, and they're going to call that holiness. But it's all about works. And as you can see, this has always been the issue of the problem within Christendom, and before Christendom, Judaism. And this is what Scripture is dealing with all the time. Now, before I jump back into this, he says if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to brag about, but not before God. I'm going to come back to this. But let me go back to, two things I want to do. I'm going to go to James, and then I'm going to go to Hebrews. I'm going to go to Hebrews. I'm going to go to James and then Hebrews 11. James and then Hebrews 11. Let me go back because I want us to have an understanding of what faith is. That's why I'm lingering here. So let's look at James, what he's saying again, because people get really tripped up over this. He says, what good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can his faith save him. Now, that's a very important issue here. Because believe it or not, there are some people that would try to use this to say, well, no salvation by faith. You got to be baptized in water, or you got to do some works, right? So he says, if he has faith but not have works. Now, I said this before. If James was talking about works to save, wouldn't he have to list the works? So, for example, when we just read it, that if Abraham was saved by works, and let me just go back here, and he says, verse 2, if Abraham was justified by works, and remember the works that he's referring to is the works of the law. If I want to even go back, let's go back to chapter 3 and look at verse 20. For no one will be justified in his sight by the works of the law. Now, what are the works of the law? Where we have over 600 commands that tell us these works. Which, by the way, if you're going to be justified, if you're going to be saved, you have to keep all 600 plus commands all the time. So what is James' subject? What is good is my brother, if someone says he has faith but does not have works, can his faith save him? So remember, the subject here is what faith is. And that's what James is talking about. So he goes on and says, if a brother and sister is without clothes and lacks daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm, eat well, but does not give him what the body needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith, if it does not have works, is dead by itself. Someone will say, you have faith, I have works. Show me your faith without works, and I will show you my faith from my works. So in other words, you can judge a person's faith by what? Their actions, the faith now, not the salvation. He says, and then he makes this spectacular comparison. You believe that God is one, you do well. The demons also believe and shudder. So he kind of gives a really good thing here in terms of the biblical faith or the saving faith, not just acknowledgement. In other words, not just saying, okay, I believe in God. Well, a lot of people believe in God, but do they believe God? And this is kind of what the dividing line is. He says, well, Satan believes in God. In fact, he probably believes in God more than you, but not saving faith. In other words, Satan has an experiential knowledge about God. God kicked him out of heaven. You believe in God, that you believe that God is one, you do well. The demons also believe, shudder. And then he says, foolish man, are you willing to learn that faith without works is useless? Wasn't Abraham, our father, justified by works? Stop. Notice what he says right here. Works. So what is the subject matter here? Right? Now watch this, because this is important. Because if a person, in my opinion, is disingenuous, they certainly would want to take a phrase like this and say, well, see, you got to work. Well, what was the works that saved Abraham? Right? So are you saying that making offerings, that saved Abraham? Watch this. Wasn't Abraham our father justified by works when he offered Isaac his son on the altar? You see that faith was active together with his works, and by works faith was perfected. In other words, putting actions to your faith. Abraham said, I believe God. Now, what is his action? Right? I believed God. All right, so then he says, so the scripture was fulfilled and said that Abraham believed God and it was credited to him for righteousness. And he was called a friend of God. So you see that a man is justified by works and not by faith alone. So now we see the context here of this statement here. What works save us? Well, then you have to go back and say, well, what are the works that save us? In other words, what Abraham's actions demonstrated or proved his faith. The action did not save him because, and by the way, when you go back and you read, like Genesis, you go back and you read that one of the things you will read, I mean, the word test or attempt means to prove. In other words, when God commanded Abraham to offer Isaac, he was testing / proving Abraham's faith. Basically, that's what he's doing. He was proving Abraham's faith. Okay? Now, the offering of Isaac itself is not what saved him. Now we have to understand that in terms of defining and understanding true faith. So, like for example, now when we come back and we say, well, let me go on and read this again. Verse 24, you see that a man is justified by works and not by faith alone, right? If again, remember the subject matter here is what faith is. And in the same way, wasn't Rahab the prostitute justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out by a different route? Now, so you see two different illustrations, two different examples that James gives. So, which of the works save us? Hiding spies or offering his only son? See, so he lists two different works. Why? Because it's not the work itself. The actions demonstrated their faith. And what James is pointing out is the God kind of faith, the biblical faith will have an action to it. In Rahab's case, it had a different action. In let me do it this way. In Rahab's case, okay, so I want to go to Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11. I'm going to read some of this. So now, what James is saying, we're going to see different actions of faith, right? So he says, now faith is the reality of what is hoped for and the proof of what is not seen. For our ancestors won God's approval by it. He says, by faith we understand that the universe was created by God's command, so that what is seen has been made from things that are not visible. By faith, Abel offered. Now, watch this. By faith, Abel offered a better sacrifice than Cain, and then by faith he was approved as a righteous man. It says because God approved his gifts, and even though he is dead, he still speaks through his faith. Now, Abel, remember Abel. Now, watch. We're going to see different works. Think about this. We're going to see different works. Abel, and I always wondered about, if you stop and you think, why did God accept Abel's offering, but he rejected Cain? And I think we see right here, because it says by faith Abel offered. So the difference is that Cain did not offer a sacrifice by faith. He just threw some up to God. He did not offer a sacrifice by faith. So by faith, that was the difference. Now, in other words, he offered what God wanted him to have. And if you go back to Cain, and if we could, by the way, could we ask, well, Cain, Why didn't Cain simply say, if God rejected Cain's offering, well, why didn't Cain humble himself and say, Lord, what would you have me to offer? See, that would have been the offering by faith. Instead, he got angry. We'll pick this up in the next study because, again, I want to explore what faith is. All right, guys, don't forget to like and share the video and subscribe to BP, The Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought or comment, add it to the comment section below. All comments are welcome.